Hi everybody. Can't believe I'm saying this, but it's the middle of the year already. It's clearly been quite a year. So, as it's the middle of the year, we always like to kind of round out and say what exactly happened in the very eventful 6 months that led up to where we are today. So with that, why don't we just kind of unpack the numbers and give you a sense of where we are on another episode of Martini Monday. Hi everybody, Marcus Collins of the MA Properties Online team with another episode of Martini Monday. So with that, I'll say cheers. As we get into a market update and see exactly where we are halfway through 2020 and what a 2020 it's been. Clearly, amazingly, none of us have ever seen anything quite like this. So let's kind of see where we are. First of all, first and foremost, where are we with the pandemic? So actually I was reading today that we are one of 4 states that have still got a declining infection rate, which is great news clearly. And I think we'll see that confidence that brings into the housing market as I talk a little bit more about what the impact of this has been on the housing market. So, but clearly a great picture as we see that number coming down. That, of course, isn't the same picture that we're seeing nationally. To some extent, we are seeing a similar picture internationally, but when we look at the United States, there are certainly large parts of it, 30 plus states, the last I read, that actually have that infection rate ticking back up again. So we're all watching that closely to see whether they can mimic what we have here in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, to some extent New York, although it's ticking back up, but clearly what we've succeeded in doing here in the northeast. So that's great news, first of all. Excuse me. Same is the case, of course, with the much more important one, the confirmed deaths. The last numbers I saw for the end of June, this is data all the way through to the end of last month, the first 6 months of this year really, was down at 0. So clearly won't stay there at that low number, but it is a very, very low number, which is great news for all of us, and so it brings that little bit of confidence to the market as well. If you can remember back to January, we predicted that we would have in the Lexington market something of a softer market as we looked into the Arlington market, tending towards that kind of softer market, stronger than we see in Lexington. But that was kind of what we were predicting back in January. Got sidelined for a few months, but as you'll see in a minute, I think we're going back to that, and that's really why previously I've kind of focused a little bit on what we said back in January. But I think you'll see as we kind of move out of this, we on the housing market specifically have certainly done that. We are going to revert to what we were predicting back in the early part of this year. The early part of this year was really dominated by economic uncertainty, the thought that there might be an economic downturn, the knowledge that there was going to be a presidential election, and that was going to bring great uncertainty, which it clearly has, to the market as we saw it. So that was kind of what we were looking at in January, and that got superseded really by the COVID-19 uncertainty, or really reality of that as we kind of move forward. So what we focused on specifically when we were looking at the market was listings, because that was the best metric we had to show when we went in, and therefore we thought, and as it turned out, the reality when we come out of this. So we focused a lot on the number of listings. So let's take a look first of all at the single family listings here in Lexington. The blue bar are the 2019 data, so that we clearly have that for the whole year. And then the orange bars are the 2020 data. Now, what you can see is that January, February, and the first half of March, we were about in parity with 2019. If you remember, it seems a long time ago, but if you remember, it was a very mild winter in the early part, mild winter 2019-2020. And so the housing market got off to a brisk start. We saw quite a few listings coming on in that early part of the year. But as far as the single family in Lexington was concerned, it really began to hit the number of listings in that second half of March. Interestingly, it really hit the buyers mid-February, because if you look at the stock market, it took a dive in mid-February, and that upset many buyers, specifically buyers of more expensive homes who had significant assets within the stock market. So that was the issue that we saw in mid-February. Once we got to mid-March and we were kind of in the full throw of this, that's when we saw the listings decline. The number of listings, and if you see in this graph, I split March into the first half of March and the second half of March, just so we can see that kind of contrast of those two parts of the month. April followed suit. We had less listings in April, and then there was a big uncertainty for us. We were kind of, are we going to see the listings come on? Was it going to be May? Was it going to be June? And then the early part of, latter part of April, early part of May, we were thinking June was going to see more come on. But as that confidence grew in the buyer community and therefore in the Lexington seller community, and with the state a whole, as that infection rate came down, so we saw more homes coming on. And as you can see from this graph, we were almost at parity with 2019 in May. And actually in June, we just kind of finished the data for June, we actually exceeded the number of properties that came on the market in 2019. Now, what I would say at this point is that I'm just comparing 2020 with 2019. If you read the market analysis, market review, what we were predicting then is that we would see more listings come on in 2020 than we saw in 2019. Correspondingly, we saw more listings in 2019 than we did in 2018. So we've seen a gradual increase in the number of listings, about the same number of sales, interestingly, and that greater number of listings are a consequence of the uncertainty. Many sellers thinking, I think I've got the top of the market here, perhaps I should bring my home on the market now as opposed to delay. And so we were predicting more listings in 2020 than we saw in 2019. But everything you see here is a comparison between 2020 and 2019. So we would have hoped to see more listings come on in 2020 were it not for this pandemic. But we're about at parity with 2019, which isn't such a bad picture. If we look at a kind of interesting view around cumulatives, the blue line here is 2019 again, and the orange line 2020. And you can see pretty clearly here where those two lines diverge. This was the point at which we saw a flattening of the number of listings, but 2019 carried on, of course. And as you can see, we haven't quite got back to parity, although in Lexington single family we're about 20 listings behind where we would expect to be the same year as 2019. Interestingly, that flattening of the curve you see there at that last, sorry, I shouldn't use that term. The flattening of this curve that you see there is a consequence of the July the 4th weekend, where we see very few homes come on the market. We would expect next week now, the week after July the 4th, to see a lot more homes coming on. And in fact, just talking to our team, we have 4 homes coming on the market this week. So we'll see a lot more come on. And I think if we were to track this out 1 or 2 weeks, we will actually be at parity with where we expect to be in 2019. So if you look at our projections here, orange again is 2020, blue is 2019. As you can see, in July and August, and to some extent September, we would expect to see a small number of homes come on the market over what we saw in 2019. And by the time we get to the fall market, we would expect to be really at parity. So almost at this point, business as usual, with that few homes coming on in July, a few more than last year, August being very low, and then we come straight away into the fall market, which we would expect to be very much the same as what we saw last year. So we've been through this, a bit like the infection and the curve that I showed you before. We've kind of been through this, and now we're getting very much back to normal. I was out this afternoon and everybody's wearing a mask. That's kind of the new normal, for us here anyway. And that I think is what we're seeing right now in the housing market here in Lexington. Let me turn my attention, if you let me take a sip here, because I'm kind of losing my voice. I should say we are in our brand new studio. We finally built. We were doing these live streams in offices, actually in our dining room, if you remember back to, I guess it was probably March or April. Now we've set ourselves up a little bit of a studio downstairs here in the basement. We've still got some work to do. The backdrop's a bit boring, but we'll fix that over the next couple of weeks or months. But we'll actually have a dedicated space down here because we're going to be doing, I'll talk more about this in a minute, our virtual seminar. Actually, we're going to continue doing that, perhaps in person as we move into the latter part of the year, but certainly for the foreseeable future, we'll also be doing a live stream of that too. So we thought it made sense to actually build a studio down here so we can carry on doing that. So let's focus a little bit on the Arlington market. Now I split Arlington into single family and into condominiums. So we have both sets of data for that. So let's look at single family first of all. Very similar picture, as you can see, to what we saw in Lexington with that parity. In fact, more than parity, we saw more homes come on the market early part of the year because of the mild winter. But then as we got to the second half of March, guess what? In came that uncertainty, and lo and behold, the number of listings declined. And that continued into April too. Now, once we get to March and June, as you can see, we're just about where we would expect to be in the numbers we saw last year. Now, our predictions for 2020 versus 2019 in Arlington were about the same. As I mentioned before, we anticipated more homes coming on the market in Lexington in 2020 versus 2019. In Arlington, we predicted about the same number. So this is the comparison we're doing here, I think, is accurate in terms of how we expected the market to play out in 2020. Cumulative again, as you can see, that early part of the year, we did very much see more listings coming on the market in 2020. But again, there's that kind of flattening there. That's that second half of March and April. Now it's pulling up again. And as I say, come the next couple of weeks, I suspect we'll be there or thereabouts with the numbers that we saw in 2019. We're about 20 listings behind, which really is not very much. When you think about it in the kind of grand plan of things, that really isn't that many listings that we're behind where we were last year. And so our predictions for 2020, we'll see a small number of extra listings coming on in July and August, and then it will be very much back to normal for the fall market and then into the winter. So that's kind of how the single family market in Arlington is going to play out. Back to normal. Same message really that we gave for Lexington. Now, if we turn our attention to the condominium market, kind of a different picture with this one, which is kind of interesting, because the slowdown in the number of listings came much later. Actually, if you look here, January, February, the whole of March and April were about at parity with what we saw last year. Slightly more in February, but not by very much. But then in May, we saw almost 50% less condominium listings in 2020 versus 2019. So that's when it began to hit. And then in June, we're about at the same. We're about at parity. And you can see that in the cumulative graph. There's that kind of more listings coming on, and then it kind of slowed down as we moved forward. So we're about, give or take, about 20 homes behind there. But you almost can't see on that graph, on the orange graph, you almost can't see that kind of slowdown. It's actually buried in this here. That's where the slowdown was in the course of really May. Let me just go back and show you that. This is where it happened in that May time frame. That's when the slowdown kicked in. And then there you can see it here. It's really in those couple of weeks that where we saw the flattening. Everybody else, we saw it second half of March. In condominium market, it was actually in May. So different picture, but same big picture, if you like. We're about that kind of 20 plus homes behind where we would expect to be based on 2019. So what does the rest of the year play out? we're a few behind. And so we would expect to see in July and August some more listings come on the market, specifically in the condo market. And that's kind of where we see that. And then, once it kind of works its way, or this lack of listings works its way out of the system, then we will begin to see back to normal for September, October, and through the end of the year. So that's kind of where that picture kind of plays out. There is an interesting question here, perhaps less about the condominium market, more about the single family market, Arlington and Lexington. How many people have decided not to put their home on the market in 2020 versus 2019? Or what we would expect, excuse me. As I said before, at Lexington we were expecting more homes to come on the market, perhaps 10, maybe even 15% more homes coming on. They didn't. So, what does that mean? I think the big question now, what does that mean for 2021? I'm not going to try and answer that here. I've got some thoughts on that, and tomorrow we're going to do a virtual seminar focused on Lexington, day after for Arlington. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So, not trying to project what we see in 2021. I'm going to tease you with that one. You've got to sit through the virtual seminar tomorrow, where I'm going to kind of explore a little bit more how we see 2021 playing out, given what we've seen in 2020. So a little bit of a teaser. If you're interested in that, if you're thinking about 2021, should I delay? Have I already delayed? What does that mean for the housing market? That will be answered in our virtual seminar, which is Lexington tomorrow on Tuesday, Arlington the next day on Wednesday. In terms of listings or showings, if you will, I've shown this graph before. Very much as we predicted, really. That red line you see there of open houses really died a death in the second half of March, really. They are beginning to come back. We're seeing more and more of them. They are the open houses we know in the past. They are very restrictive in terms of what you can do, how many people can go in. They're a little bit problematic for a home which is very popular, because you can end up with a lot of people wanting to get into the home and really not the time to do that. So if you're a buyer in this market, or even if you're a seller in this market wanting to go to open houses to see what the competition is or what the other homes on the market are like, be cautious when you're thinking about going to open houses. They're really not the free-for-all they were previously. They are very controlled. And so don't expect to be able to just turn up and walk around. There is a kind of gating, a gate factor, if you like, in terms of how many people can go in the home. And that can mean a long wait outside. So if you are interested in going to see a home, perhaps best to talk to your buyer's agent to get you in to see it as a private showing. It's much easier. The open houses can be a little bit frustrating at the moment, certainly for buyers, that's for sure. Same with private showings. I mean, those are increasing as well. That, I think, is the preferred way to see, and certainly the buyers that I'm talking to and that I'm advising my team when they're thinking about showings, my advice is always avoid the open house, just because of that potential for a very frustrating environment, and then focus very much on doing that private showing. You get the time in the home to actually see it properly. In terms of virtual showings, I mean, the 3D tours and videos, that's beginning to decline. If you look at that, definitely was more than we've seen in previous years. As I've said before on this channel, we do a lot of marketing, enabling buyers to look at homes virtually. That's beginning to drop off with the agents that did it at the beginning, and now they're kind of rolling that back. Unfortunately, that's the case. So we do it for all of ours because we do think that virtual showing is a great way to give that first introduction to the home. And then if somebody is really interested in the home, then they'll make that private showing. So that's kind of where we are with the showings in 2020. I guess I didn't hint. I gave a kind of big splurge about our virtual seminar that's coming up. Tomorrow, July 7th, we have a focus on the Lexington market. And then July 8th, that's the next day on Wednesday, we have a focus on the Arlington market. We're going to talk about the current market conditions in a lot more detail than what we did today. We really focused on the number of listings today. I'm going to focus more on kind of the bigger picture. And I'm also going to get that crystal ball out for 2021 to see quite what the rest of 2020 is going to play out. But really, I think You know, there's a lot of people now beginning to think, so what does it mean for next year? A little bit dependent on the election that's coming up and how that plays out, of course, but how is the market this year affecting what 2021 is going to look like? Then we'll take a look at selling and buying in 2020. Specifically, we're going to look at virtual buying and virtual selling. Now we're out of that lockdown phase into that phase that we're calling buyer confidence returns, and it definitely has. What does that actually mean? What does a virtual buying and selling process actually mean? So we will be doing that as well at that virtual seminar. Finally then, we will be doing the same as Martini Monday. We will be pushing that out on Facebook, YouTube and Twitch. So all of those different channels. So if you're at all interested in the market, I would highly recommend you come watch our virtual seminar. They're not online, they're all virtual. So with that, I will say cheers and good night. And thank you for watching this episode of Martini Monday. And I do hope that you will have the opportunity to join us for our virtual seminar July 7th for Lexington and July 8th for Arlington. So with that, I'll say goodbye. Bye.